After the flood, the world started over. Noah stepped off the ark onto a cleansed earth. His sons began to multiply, nations began to form, cities began to rise. And in the middle of all of that new beginning, one man emerged above everyone else. The text describes him with language it uses for no other human being in the entire book of Genesis. He was the first mighty man on earth, a mighty hunter before the Lord, the founder of the first empire in human history, the builder of the most famous city ever constructed, the man behind the tower that made God himself come down to intervene. And he was African, the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham, the great-grandson of Noah. His name was Nimrod. And his story has been sitting in Genesis chapter 10 for thousands of years, largely ignored, consistently misrepresented, and almost never taught in its full historical and biblical context. Today, we change that.
Welcome back to Forgotten Tribes and Scrolls. Today we open the scroll on Nimrod, one of the most fascinating and most misunderstood figures in all of the post-flood biblical narrative. A man who appears in only a few verses of Genesis, but whose story reverberates through the entire ancient world. A man whose name appears in the historical records of multiple ancient civilizations. A man whose legacy shaped the geography, the politics, and the spiritual trajectory of the ancient world for centuries. And a man who was African. Let's get into it. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ur, Calah, and Resen, which is between Nineveh and Calah, which is the great city. Let us slow down and look at what the text is actually telling us. Nimrod is the son of Cush. Cush is the son of Ham, which makes Nimrod the grandson of Ham and the great-grandson of Noah. He is African. He is Cushite. He is from the same bloodline that produced Ethiopia and Nubia and the great African civilizations we have studied throughout this series. And the text says he was the first mighty man on earth. The first, before Pharaoh, before any Israelite king, before any Assyrian or Babylonian or Persian emperor. The first mighty man in the post-flood world was a Cushite African. The phrase, mighty hunter before the Lord, deserves its own examination. In Hebrew, the word used for mighty is Gibbor. It is the same word used later in Scripture for the mighty men of David, his elite warriors. It is a word that carries the weight of extraordinary strength, skill, and power. Not just physical power, but a kind of commanding, dominating authority over everything around him. And the phrase, before the Lord, in this context, is significant. It does not necessarily mean in honor of the Lord or in obedience to the Lord. In Hebrew idiom, it can simply mean in the sight of God, meaning God himself acknowledged and witnessed the scale of Nimrod's power. There is also an ancient Jewish tradition, recorded in the writings of Josephus, that interprets the phrase mighty hunter before the Lord in a more ominous way. Josephus writes that Nimrod gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God. He became a great leader and drew people away from the worship of God through his personal power and charisma. Whether you take the text as simply descriptive of Nimrod's physical greatness or as carrying a darker theological meaning, the scale of what he accomplished is undeniable. He was the most powerful individual on earth in the earliest post-flood generations. Look at what Nimrod built. The text lists his cities: Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, Nineveh.
These are not minor settlements. These are the foundational cities of the ancient Near Eastern world. Babylon, which would go on to become the most powerful empire in the ancient world under Nebuchadnezzar. Uruk, one of the earliest and largest cities in human history. Akkad, the capital of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad. Nineveh, the great capital of the Assyrian Empire. The cities Nimrod built became the capitals of the greatest empires of the ancient world. He was not just a hunter or a warrior. He was a builder, an organizer, an empire architect. The man who first figured out how to gather dispersed post-flood humanity into organized urban centers and structured political power. Genesis calls his kingdom in Shinar. Shinar is Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq. And the text says he went from Shinar to Assyria and built there too. He built cities in two of the most powerful ancient territories on earth, and he built them first, before anyone else.
Now we get to the moment that most people associate with Nimrod, even though the text of Genesis 11 does not name him directly. Genesis chapter 11. The entire earth has one language and one speech. The people gather in the plain of Shinar, Nimrod's territory, and they say, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves." Jewish tradition almost universally connects this building project to Nimrod. Josephus writes explicitly that Nimrod persuaded the people to build the tower as an act of defiance against God. The Targum, the ancient Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible, directly names Nimrod as the leader of the tower building project. The Tower of Babel was not a random community project. It was a political and spiritual statement made by the most powerful man on earth. A statement that said, we do not need to spread across the earth as God commanded. We do not need to depend on God for our security. We will build our own monument. We will make our own name. We will create our own unity on our own terms. And God came down, not because the tower was physically reaching him, but because what the tower represented, the consolidation of human power in defiance of divine ordering, was
dangerous enough to require divine intervention. God confused their language. The building stopped. The people scattered. And the first empire ended the way every empire that sets itself against God eventually ends.
Here is what makes the study of Nimrod even more fascinating. He does not just appear in the Bible. He appears across multiple ancient traditions and historical records in ways that suggest his historical impact was enormous. In ancient Mesopotamian records, the figure of Nimrod has been connected by many scholars to Sargon of Akkad, the first empire builder of Mesopotamia who ruled around 2334 BC. Sargon built an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, the largest the ancient world had seen up to that point. The parallels between Sargon and the biblical Nimrod are remarkable. The Gilgamesh epic, one of the oldest pieces of literature on Earth, has also been connected to the Nimrod tradition. Gilgamesh was the legendary king of Uruk, one of the cities Nimrod built. He was described as a mighty warrior and hunter of extraordinary power, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. The connections are not perfect, and scholars debate them vigorously. But the consistency of the tradition, a great post-flood king building the first cities of Mesopotamia across multiple ancient sources, suggests that the biblical Nimrod was a real historical figure, whose impact was so significant that multiple civilizations preserved his memory in different forms. And he was Cushite, African, the son of Cush.
Here is what I want you to carry away from this episode. In the earliest post-flood world, when humanity was beginning again from scratch, the first man to rise to extraordinary power and influence was not from the line of Shem, not from the line that would eventually produce Abraham and Israel. The first mighty man on earth was from the line of Ham,
from the line of Cush, from Africa. Nimrod organized the first cities, built the first empire, constructed the foundational urban centers of what would become the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. And he did it before anyone else. Now, there are complex theological questions around Nimrod, questions about whether his empire was built in obedience to or defiance of God. Those questions are worth studying, and we are not going to rush past them. But before we get to the theological evaluation, we need to sit with the historical reality. The most powerful individual in the post-flood world was an African man. The builder of Babylon was African. The builder of Nineveh was African. The man who organized the first recorded human empire was the son of Cush. And that fact has been sitting in Genesis chapter 10 for thousands of years, waiting to be read carefully.
Nimrod was the son of Cush, the grandson of Ham. He was the first mighty man on earth. He built Babylon and Nineveh and the foundational cities of the ancient Near East. He organized the first empire in human history, and he was African. His story raises complex theological questions, but before the theology, there is the text, and the text is clear. The first empire builder in the post-flood world was Cushite, was African, was from the same bloodline that gave us Cush and Ethiopia, and the great African civilizations that run like a golden thread through the entire biblical narrative. Nimrod has been hiding in Genesis chapter 10 for thousands of years. It is time to read what the text actually says about him. Subscribe to Forgotten Tribes and Scrolls. Next episode, the Book of Jubilees and Africa, the ancient hidden text that fills in the gaps of Genesis. What it says about the division of the earth among Noah's sons, the African territories given to Ham, and what Jubilees reveals about Hagar, Ishmael, and their African descendants that Genesis does not tell us. See you there.